going to start and I will just introduce myself. So I'm Pressley Buurma. I'm the Seneca County Agriculture and Natural Resources Educator. I've been raising dairy goats for most of my life. I always showed in 4-H and FFA. I did dairy market kids for the majority of it. And currently we have alpines and registered Nigerian dwarfs. I also have a colleague here with me today, Matt, and I'm going to have him introduce himself.
I'm Matthew. So I'm the new livestock judging coach with Ohio State University here in Columbus. So would have spent a majority of my life there in Maryland. Oldest of three, and we grew up in 4-H and FFA, showing meat goats, market lambs, and even some show pigs as well. Spent 2 years in Kansas, 2 years in South Dakota, and then just wrapped up my master's from North Dakota State this past summer in lamb meat quality and marketability. So glad that Pressley was able to get me on here today, and looking forward to hearing from each of you in terms of some questions that you each might have in terms of even some dairy goats or even some meat goat discussion there. So thank you for having me.
Awesome. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. So I am going to be focusing on the dairy side of the animal evaluation, and Matt is going to be talking more on the meat side and then just general live animal eval. So with the dairy, the number one thing you want to think about is the scorecard. You can get the scorecard from the American Dairy Goat Association. It's adga.org. And the scorecard is going to show you exactly how to judge that animal. So I have the scorecard kind of broken down here. And the first category that it covers is general appearance. General appearance is an attractive framework with femininity if it's a female or masculinity if it's a male. Strength, upstandingness, length, and smoothness of blending throughout that create an impressive style and graceful walk. And as you can see, there's different categories when we're looking at the scorecards. You can score a senior doe, a junior doe, and a buck. When we're talking about general appearance, you can see that the score for it, they're high. It's out of 100. So for junior doe and buck, it's over half of the points that you would give, and that's because it has a lot of very important steps or things to look at within general appearance, which would be the head and breed characteristics, front end assembly, the back, the rump, and the legs, feet, and pasterns. The next category is dairy strength. This is long bone pattern throughout, openness and angularity with strong yet refined and clean bone structure, showing enough substance but with freedom from coarseness and with evidence of milking ability, giving due regard to the stage of lactation, or if you're looking at a buck, it would be of breeding season. And again, there are categories within dairy strength that we're going to look at, and that would be the neck, the withers, the ribs, flank, thighs, and skin. The next one is body capacity. This is relatively large in proportion in size, age, and period of lactation or breeding season in bucks, providing ample capacity, strength, and vigor. And we'll look at the chest and the barrel when we're talking about body capacity. And then in the mammary system, as you can see, there is no points for a junior doe or a buck. Buck, obviously, because it's not going to have the mammary system. And for a junior doe, because it has not yet given birth, so it will not be in milk or lactation. So in a senior doe, when we're talking about the mammary system, you want a strongly attached, elastic, well-balanced with adequate capacity, quality, ease of milking, and indicating heavy milk production over a period of usefulness. And then within the mammary system, we want to look at udder support, fore udder, rear udder, balance, symmetry, and quality, and teats. So now that we know kind of what we're looking for on the scorecard side of things, now I really want to dive into these categories and look more specifically on what we're looking for with the does. So first we're going to start with the legs, the feet, and the pasterns. For me, when the first thing I look at when I'm looking at an animal is I'm going to look at its legs, feet, and pasterns, and I'm going to look how it walks. Because if there's something wrong with the feet, it's going to trace all the way up the animal. It's going to have issues in its shoulder, possibly its neck, up its back line, and a lot of those are going to radiate from feet, pastern, and leg problems. So it's always the first thing I look at. And I want to make sure I'm looking at them standing as well as moving. So in dairy goats, specifically the does, you want a strong leg bone, smooth movement, and longer strides. And when we're talking about the strides, you want to make sure that as they bring their back foot forward, the toe of their back foot is actually going to touch the heel of their front foot. And you want to make sure that they're walking in a nice line. Where the front foot let off is where the back foot's going to come down. It's not going to be out to one side or another. You want straight and square forelegs, clean straight knees, strong pasterns and long pasterns, short strong toes, straight forward foot, width between the hind legs, the hock angle and a clean hock. You want perpendicular from the hock to the pasterns, a good angle through the stifle, straight rear leg set, and flexible pasterns. So I'm going to go through this presentation and there will be several photos that look like this throughout it. And if there's any livestock kids on here who might be in 4-H, these will look familiar to you because these are out of the resource handbook that you would get when you join the program and get started in goats. And the picture here on the left is going to show the ideal formation when you're looking at the rear legs from a side profile. And the best way to determine if it's ideal or if it's going to have either weak, sickle hocked, or post legged is you're going to go to about the pins and you're going to drop a line down. And when you drop the line down in an ideal setting, obviously you're not going to have an actual line that you're dropping down. This would just be a pretty visual thing that you'll be doing. And when you drop the line down, you're going to want it to hit the hock and travel down the leg, but you don't want your pasterns or your foot to be in that line. You want it slightly in front of that line to have a good ideal rear leg conformation. If we want to look at a post-legged animal, when you drop that line, it's going to come down and it's actually going to dissect right through the hock and the leg down into the pastern and the hoof. When we're looking at sickle hocked, it's going to come down and it might meet the hock or the hock might go slightly past it, but it's not going to come in contact with the rest of your leg, and your toes are going to be um, more angled forward and they're going to be more placed under your teats than back behind the back of your udder or the back of the body. And if we're looking at the weak pasterns here, you're going to drop your line and the point of view it's going to come through the leg of the animal and actually more towards the toe. It's not going to hit the back of the hock or the leg as you would prefer. When we're looking at the front legs, if we look at buck knees here, they're going to stick out. They're going to be wider than the ideal setting. And when we look at knock knees here, the knees are going to point inward, with the ideal coming straight out from the chest and the inside shoulder placement. When we're looking at the rear legs, close at the hocks, your hocks here are going to be pointed inward. If we're looking at a bow-legged animal, the hocks are going to be pointing outward. And in an ideal setting, your legs are going to come straight down out of your hips. Next, we're going to move on to front end assembly. So I have a picture here of a Saanen goat. This picture is from the American Dairy Goat Association, and she's going to be my model today as we work through some of these types or conformations. So you want smooth from the neck into the withers, and this is going to be this conformation here. And you really want a prominent withers at the point of shoulder and a smooth point of shoulder and shoulder blade, which is going to be looking in this general direction. And when you're looking at the withers, you want to make sure they have an arch over the point of shoulder or kind of like a rainbow shape across here as well. You want a tight and smooth point of elbow, as we can see here. And when you're looking at front end assembly, not only do you want to look at the side profile, but you also want to look at the front profile. You want to look at them straight on and really look at that chest floor. You want to make sure it's deep and wide with a moderate brisket. You don't want too much excessive skin or fat hanging off the chest of the animal, but you also want some sort of moderate brisket. Next, we're going to look at the back and rump. And with the back, you want to define vertebra. You don't want them to look sickly. You don't want them to be too skinny, but you definitely want to see that defined vertebra running down their back line. They are going to be taller at their withers than their hips, and they're going to have a straight and strong top line. You want to make sure to pay close attention to the chine and loin areas. You really want to make sure you have a strong loin and a prominent chine and wide hips. When we're looking at the rump, you want strength and width. You want level from your hips to the pin bones and in your thurls, and you want a blended tail head. When you're looking at the rump, you want to make sure to look at it from a side profile as well as directly on, just like we had talked about with the front end. And you want to make sure you have very well-defined pin bones, and the pin bones are set lower than your hips. You also want to make sure to look at the vulva. You want to have a normal vulva in shape and size. If you have any issues with the vulva, you're not going to want to breed this animal and you're not going to want to pass on the genetics. So it's very important that not only the vulva is placed correctly, but that the rump has good conformation and correct standards in the back so that you do have a good breeding season and a good and easy birth. So when we're looking at the back line, we can see this top picture in the left, it's a wavy back. As you go from the withers to um, the hip back here, you're going to run a line through and it's going to dip and then it's going to come back up right before the hip. That would be a wavy back line. Here in the middle is an ideal back line. It's going to run straight from the withers down to the hip bones down here. If we look at a sway back, I always think of this as I call it a saddleback because if you think you just rode this animal like a horse and you get off of it and their back doesn't go back to normal. That's how I always think of a sway back. But that's the conformation that it would be. With a roached back, it's actually going to come up and over that line, the ideal line from the withers to the hips. And if you're weak in the chine, you're going to have a dip right below or right behind the withers. Next, we're going to talk about the mammary system. And with the mammary system, I know this is a lot of words, but it is very important because they're dairy animals and their main contribution to you is going to be their milk. And you want to make sure that their mammary system and their udders have great conformation and are going to be useful for you to be able to get that milk from them, as well as pass down good genetics to their kids. So when we're talking about the mammary system and the udders, they really need to support good milk production for many years. You don't want an udder that's only going to last you 1 or 2 years. You want to make sure to get as much use out of that animal as possible. You want a strong medial ligament, clearly defined udder halves with good shape and capacity. You want your udder placement to be high and you want to make sure it's above your hocks. And the udder needs to be placed strongly into the body. You want a strong and smooth fore, rear, and lateral attachments. The fore udder needs to have good shape, wide and full to the sides with no excessive tissue. When we're looking at the rear udder, you want to make sure it's high and wide and has a deep, wide udder floor. The rear udder should be less protruding than the vulva, has correct balance and symmetry. You want two teats, uniform in size, shape, and placement, and you want to make sure they're cylindrical. The orifice of those teats need to face downward. If there's any issues within the udder, any of the ligaments or the attachments, that Looking at your teats and making sure the orifices are going straight down is a good idea that your ligaments are probably in good standing. They're pretty secure. They're doing a good job. If your orifices or your teats are facing one way or another, then that gives you an idea that, hey, something's not right here in the udder attachment. You also want to make sure you have proper placement when viewing from all angles. You want to view the udder straight on from the rear as well as from the side profile. And when you're looking at it from one side or another, if you're standing directly straight on the sides, you should only be able to see one teat because they're in correct placement on that udder. And when you're viewing from the rear, again, you want to make sure that the orifices of the teats are facing straight down and that they are uniform in size and shape. You also want to make sure that there's indications of ease of milking and you have no current leaking. So when we're looking at the 4 udder attachments, if you're looking at this ideal udder, it's high and tight up into the body, up into the flank here, and it has good placement of the teats. As you can also see in this broken attachment, the udder almost looks like it fell off the underside of this goat's abdomen, and that's because the attachment um, detached. The udder has fallen, you can say. If you also see here, a good indication that you have such detachment is going to come from seeing that the udder has been placed below the hock. When we're looking at the udder from a rear, again, this is ideal. And on the broken side, you can see that you're not going to have a wide base within your legs as you would typically see on the ideal side, as you need room for that full udder and the high and tight attached udder. And also with the broken udder here, again, it's below the hocks, whereas the ideal is sitting high above. And the medial suspensory ligament here, if it's broken, like I said, your teats are going to be facing outward. They're not going to be facing down. The orifices are going to be facing out slightly, and oftentimes you're not going to have a butterfly shape. When we look at the weakened one over here, you can see that the teats kind of come down, and if they would keep coming, it's almost like they would come together and touch down here. There's not much space between them, and you're not getting a good butterfly shape here in the middle. When we look at the ideal udder, it's going to have this nice round section and another round section. You can clearly see 1 and 2 sections, one for each teat. And it's going to give this nice butterfly shape through the udder. The teats are facing downward and the orifices are facing downward. They're in good cylindrical placement. And if we look at the hocks, both the broken and the weakened are going to fall below, whereas the ideal is high and above. And next, we're going to talk about general appearance. With this, you really want to look at the framework, femininity versus masculinity, whether you're looking at a male or a female, or if you have a female with male characteristics or a male with female characteristics, which you don't want. You can have smoothness and blending throughout. You really want graceful movements. You want these free flowing movements. The animal can move without any trouble, and there's nothing blocking or disrupting their movements. And they need to have good impressive style, good overall movement and framework. And when you're thinking about general appearance, it's like it says, can you look at the animal? Does it look good? Is there anything as it's moving or as it's standing there, as it's walking around that you're like, something's not quite right with that? Or does it look good? Is the color patterns good? Does this general appearance look good? The movement looks good. It looks feminine. It's very smooth, etc. When we're looking at the head and breed standards, you want to make sure that you know the standards for that specific breed. It's very important in dairy because each dairy breed has its own specific standards, and you can get those from the American Dairy Goat Association or adga.org. And that website is going to be your best friend when it comes to these breed standards. Breed standards is really going to refer to the overall animal appearance, but the biggest difference between these breeds is going to be their heads. Their muzzle shape, if you remember from last week, we had Romans and we had dished and straight muzzles. Ear length, La Manchas are going to have those really short ears, whereas Alpines are going to have the erect front-facing ears, and Nubians are going to have the cylindrical, low-hanging ears. And the shape of the ears are going to be different between the breeds, as well as where they're set on the body. And then if we dive a little deeper into the head here, you really want to make sure you have a clean cut, balanced head with a broad muzzle and full nostrils. They need to be alert in their head and their eyes and have a real nice angular jaw. So I have some pictures here from the American Dairy Goat Association, and it kind of outlines what you're looking at when you are looking at the different head placements. So if we look at the coarse head up here, we really want to see how the head angles and comes off the neck and how it follows through down the muzzle into the mouth and into the nostrils. And as we're coming here in a coarse head, it's going to be, I like to describe it as a more short and stubby head. You're not going to have any broadness of your muzzle. Your nostrils are probably not going to be at full capacity. And the angle coming off the neck into the head and down into the jaw is going to be very sharp and very coarse. If we look at the frail head standard here, you can see that the angle coming off the neck is not quite set, and getting into the jaw, there's not much angularity into this jaw. You're going to have tight nostril placement, and you're really going to have a long, extended muzzle. You're not going to have that broad, thick muzzle that you're looking for. And if we look at the ideal standard here, we have nice angles up in from the neck into the head, down into this jaw, a full nostril, correct ear placement, and when we go down the muzzle, it's nice and broad and it gives us that shape that we can see without losing too much of its texture. With the dairy strength, you really want to make sure you have good long bone pattern. You're going to have more openness, a strong, refined bone structure, good milking ability, a long, lean neck, clean cut throat and brisket, the rainbow angulation in the withers prominent above the shoulder blades at the point of shoulder, a flat open rib cage, long spaced ribs angled to the flank, a deep flank with high arch, clean thigh more wide apart. And if you've ever seen a dairy show, you know that when they go to set up their animal, they're gonna bring those rear legs out slightly. They're not going to come down square with the hips. They're going to come out slightly in order to make sure that one, we can see that full udder placement if you're looking at a doe. And if you're not, if you're looking at a buck or if you're looking at a wether and you're showing in a 4-H, you really need to see those thighs and that incurving from the pin bone to the stifle. They're also going to have thinner skin and pliable hair. And when we look at that incurving, these pictures are from the American Dairy Goat Association. And if we look at the correct incurving here, it's going to come distinctly in from the pin bones. It's going to have a very prominent incurve from the pin bones into the stifle. When we look at the incorrect curving here, it gives a really nice S shape, but this is not what you want in dairy goats. It's going to cause issues when it comes later down into the breeding and the birthing, as well as it's not showing you the nice udder placement. As you can see in the correct incurving here, you're able to see the full udder, the entire length of the leg from where it attaches down to the teat. And in the incorrect curving, you're not able to see much of that rear udder placement. You're really only able to see the fore udder, which is important, but you really need to make sure you can see the rear udder placing from where it attaches down to the teat. And body capacity. Again, I have this nice sonnet here that I'm using as my demonstration. And some things to consider: your age, stage of lactation, if it's breathing season for a buck, and size correlation. So you really want to make sure that you have a deep chest with a wide floor, widely sprung ribs, deeper in the ribs, and a wide, long barrel. The barrel is going to be this middle section here of your dough. And the reason that you want a nice, deep, wide barrel is because this is where the baby's gonna sit. Is there's accurate room for a baby to be there? Maybe with dairy goats, oftentimes you're having twins and triplets. Is there enough room to have those babies in the animal? As well as, is it big enough to one, fit the breed standards, two, have the babies, but also three, be able to use its body to produce the amount of milk that you need to fit those babies and to fit your operation. So we went over what to look for in the does, and I'm just going to briefly touch on what to look for in the bucks. A lot of it's similar. It's just not going to be as pronounced. One thing that is different, obviously it's a buck, we're not going to look at their mammary system, but we are going to pay attention to their reproductive organs. So in bucks, you want to look at their general appearance, dairy character, body capacity, and like I said, the reproductive organs. So, with the general appearance, they're going to be strong and muscular, clean cut, and have smooth, alert movements. Very similar to what we talked about in the does. You want to make sure that they have free flowing movements. They're able to move without anything stopping them or any coarseness or struggling in their movements. With the dairy character, very similar. You want to make sure to have good angularity and general openness, and you don't want the beefiness. Although it is a buck, it is going to be slightly more muscled than the does, but you don't want that heavy meat character on these bucks because it could prevent them from passing down the dairy qualities that you need. With body capacity, you just want large in portion. Some breeds, specifically Nigerian dwarfs, they are going to have, they're smaller than the Alpines and the Saanens and some of the standard breeds, but they need to be large in part for that breed standard. And you want to make sure it amplifies strength and vigor. With the reproductive organs, you want two symmetrical testicles. And when you're looking at the testicles, actually the size of the testicles, you want to make sure they're smooth and cylindrical. They're both the same size, but also the bigger the testicle, the more likely chance you are to have better reproduction with that male. And you want to make sure the teats are you have two cylindrical teats as well that are symmetrical and evenly spaced, and a strong attachment of that scrotum. You don't want it high and tight up into the body, but you want to make sure it has good attachment and it's not just hanging. That is all I have for the dairy side of things. If you have any questions, please put it into the Q&A, and then I am going to let Matt share his screen and he's going to go over the rest of it with you.
Perfect. Presley, can everyone see the screen there? Perfect. Well, we're gonna go over very something similar to what Presley would have just talked about there in terms of understanding kind of dairy character, dairy evaluation there on those goats. We're gonna do the opposite there and talk about kind of your boar goats, your meat goats, market goats there as well. And this is kind of a PowerPoint slide that when it comes to introductory livestock evaluation that we talk and kind of instruct there on campus with the introduction to livestock evaluation class. So a lot of it might be, maybe a little bit more simpler, not as just kind of intense there with some terminology that you might hear there at some of these livestock shows. So let's see. Perfect. So when it comes to just basic evaluation, what I want us to understand is that when we sit down and decide we're going to evaluate livestock, whether it's for your first project, whether it's for a breeding decision, whether it's to maybe keep or cull some does, you're ultimately just trying to determine the value, the nature, the character, and quality of something. So when it comes to evaluating our meat goats here, we're going to evaluate them a couple different ways. So simple pictures. You got a market goat there to the left, one there in the middle. and then another kind of boar goat there to the right. So I think the best approach to this is to understand our ideals. And in understanding our ideals, we realize, okay, we got two very nice ones. One that just doesn't look the thriftiest out there, probably because it got sick, didn't necessarily eat or get enough just kind of colostrum in them. So in understanding those ideals, now we can, start to break down which ones are kind of elite, which ones are great, which ones are a bit more average and poor. So a lot of the priorities we're going to talk about are going to be very similar to what you guys would have just heard as well. And honestly, what Pressley was talking about in terms of skulls on some dairy goats there, in terms of your ideals, is very, indicative to what you can kind of tell later on with that animal. So from a muscularity standpoint, a lot of skull shapes, even some eyes, some ocular shape is going to be extremely important as well. So when it comes to priorities, we're going to focus on structure, some sort of mobility. We're going to then try and add on as much muscularity as possible. So trying to make these animals have some sort of skeletal width to them. So whether that's back shape, some pin width, some quarter shape, some even kind of lower leg or glute shape as well is going to be very important. Along with that, we want animals that feed well. We want animals that are practical, that have some sort of productivity to them as well. So rib dimension, some body quality is going to be very important. And then that also goes hand in hand with some sort of feeding ability. So those flatter ribbed animals, 9 times out of 10, are not necessarily going to feed as well as a few of those animals that are better in terms of their rib cage. Along with that, we're going to talk and kind of understand a little bit more how those 3 priorities we just talked about all add together into that balance equation. And then lastly, we're going to talk some handle quality, some freshness and condition, and then we'll even judge one class as well. So when it comes to structure and mobility, a lot of that skeletal correctness is going to start there, at the surface, start in terms of their feet and legs, start in terms of their shoulder blade angle as well. And for a lot of people, where I tell them the first, where you first might notice some sort of structural correctness is in that animal's spine. If that animal's spine might deviate or get a little bit more relaxed or maybe get a little bit higher in certain areas, 9 times out of 10, something structurally is an issue there. So when it comes to understanding structure and kind of breaking that down further, we're going to start up front and look at their shoulder blade. We want their shoulder blade to be angled at about a 45 degree angle. We don't want it too straight, more like a 60-degree angle, because if it's too straight, those animals are probably going to be a little tighter spine. They're going to toe their front feet kind of more so east and west rather than kind of north and south there. So structurally, a nice 45-degree angle kind of sets the stage for what we're looking for. When their shoulder blade is angled right, we can notice that their front feet are going to point in that kind of that forward direction and get kind of not necessarily point out in opposite directions, but it will sit down square. Their knees are going to be relaxed and kind of pushed back into them. And then at the same time, we can start on kind of their midsection back, working towards kind of the back half of that goat. So their top lines, we want those to be smooth as well. We want their hip and their hip length to be long and relatively level. On goats and sheep, there's a lot of discussion. On our sheep, we want them to be as level as possible. But on goats, we understand there's going to be a slight slope out of their hip and kind of their tail structure as well. So we start to see a little bit kind of some deviation there between species. But on goats, as level as we can make them is probably a little bit more ideal in terms of how the industry's heading. So along with that, we don't necessarily want their hips to be too short or too steep because it just kind of throws off the balance of that goat. And then when their hips are long and level, we have a little bit of a neater hind leg set, some rear leg posture discussion as well. So their hocks are going to sit in them nice. And when it comes to just naturally moving those animals, they're going to flex with a whole lot more ease and just comfort and mobility. So there's a lot of things, a lot of moving parts that go into that structure conversation. So understanding that, kind of breaking that down, realizing that a lot of structural issues start there at the shoulder blade is probably the best thing in terms of trying to notice where animals good structured versus kind of poor structured. Some skeletal with conversation. So we talk structure. Now we're going to talk some muscle. When it comes to muscle, there's a lot of different views that we can get on an animal. So a lot of people will say sometimes the more the merrier. But at the same time, when you get too much muscle on an animal, it starts to weaken their structure and their mobility. They get a little bit tighter, a little bit shorter stepping as well. So when it comes to looking for muscle, we're going to first look at the surface. Animals that are naturally wide down low are going to feed with more muscle. They're going to grow and mature with more muscle. So if you look at the surface and animals, that stands naturally wider down low, is 9 times out of 10 going to be bigger in their upper hip. So their pin width is going to be larger. They're going to naturally just kind of mature and man up with a little bit more leg shape. So some stifle shape as well, even some twist differences. So a heavier muscled animal is going to be deeper twisted than kind of a shallower twisted, lighter muscled goat. Along with that, we can look down their top, and when you see judges there at shows that are handling the tops of those goats, they're ultimately looking for kind of the width and even the progression of muscle down their rack and even over their loin. So there's a lot of indicators. And then to kind of even tie back to what Pressley said earlier in terms of their skulls, you don't want like a coarse-headed one. You don't want a frail, long-headed one. You want one that's going to be stout, one that's kind of deeper and square about their jaw shape, one that's got a good shape there to their kind of the crest of their nose. So a lot of those things, a lot of those indicators of muscle are going to start at that animal's head. So a professor back in the day by the name of Norman Cole would have said that, the stouter an animal's head is, the stouter the stouter the kids that they're going to be able to just naturally kind of push out their come kidding time. So a stouter headed one can have a stouter kind of baby on the back end of things as well. So really look at their skulls, look at their chests, base width. They're all going to be kind of very important factors to notice. So along with that, so we saw here in the last slide, kind of a rear shot of that goat. Here is a bit of a 3/4 there on the goat as well. So we talked a little bit about their chest width. So we want them wide and opened up front. We want them to be good in terms of their base width and still square at the surface. When I mentioned their twist, so their twist would be from here to here. So kind of right there from their butthole to the kind of the crease of where their leg kind of joins together with the other half. That's going to be their twist. We got our stifle shape there on the other side. But really on this 3/4 view, what I want you guys to look at is their forearm. A stouter featured animal is going to have a stouter forearm. That's just, naturally going to work with more muscle. To even take this maybe one step further, when it comes to just, us as humans, when we're trying to work out, when we're trying to put on muscle, we might look at the person next to us and they're, ripped up, they're strong, they're muscular. Their bones, their forearms, their smaller muscles are going to be much larger in size. Same thing with livestock. And a lot of people raise and even breed and kind of get livestock ready in a way similar to how bodybuilders prepare for a contest. So that's another view, kind of a 3/4 shot there on that goat for muscle. On the kind of the rib dimensions, some rib shape, some practicality, feedability, and even body quality that goes into these livestock. We want those animals to be bold. We want them to be round-bodied. Animals that are naturally heavier muscled are going to have a better shape to their rib cage because when you think about opening up and taking your hands down the back of a goat, kind of their rack and their loin, if they're wider up here, they're going to have more natural internal dimension to them. those animals are going to have a better curvature to their rib cage. They're going to be better in terms of their just kind of center body cavity as well. So if an animal's narrower up top here, they're going to be flatter bodied, and not necessarily as round or bull bodied. And those are kind of big differences kind of there. The balance side of things. And like I talked about, balance is, a blend of all three of those priorities that we just would have talked about. So balance ultimately needs, I guess the end of that equation, when an animal's good structured, when an animal is muscular and has muscle, and when an animal has plenty of rib and just body dimension to them, those animals are going to naturally balance easier. Let's say if for example an animal has muscle and they got plenty of body to them, but their spines are too kind of up in the air, or they sit too low or easy in them, those animals from a structure standpoint probably don't check that box. So when it comes to balancing, you got a muscular go with a kind of an easy top line in them, they're not going to balance the best. Let's say you got a very good structured animal, but that good structured animal doesn't have any rib shape and they're really high flanked, but they have muscle, where that animal ultimately will not balance the best. So, each of those priorities go hand in hand with each other. So in order for an animal to balance, they have to check each of those boxes, if that makes sense. And then really I got kind of in the asterisk there, that bone also helps aid in balance. So a bigger boned, a bigger footed animal can just kind of cap off the essence of balance, that overall look that animal has there out from the side. So really between these goats, we got one that from a structural kind of skeletal organization standpoint is very good from a structure side of things. That one's still got a stout forearm, kind of a good shape there to their stifle. In terms of body, that goat, I'd expect to be kind of a little bit rounder bodied in terms of how they open up on the top side of their skeleton, versus kind of maybe this goat who's a bit flatter in their body shape, a little bit frailer there in their forearm, a little bit lighter muscle there in terms of their kind of their glute shape, their stifle shape. So we see how maybe this animal, who's just nice structured, doesn't have enough muscle, but that goat never balances because of that. This goat, who's good structured, has muscle, and has ample amounts of rib shape to him, that animal balances much easier than this one there on the right. So now when it comes to kind of handling, whether it's market lambs or even market goats, when it comes to handling, handling quality of kind of running your hand down their rack and their loin, ultimately what we're trying to feel is what we're seeing from the outside. So from the outside looking in, we want those animals, if we see they got a stout forearm and they got some leg shape to them, we're going to expect those animals to touch with muscle when you get your hands up on them. So you start at their rack and kind of work your way down their loin. And we're just kind of really, in essence, just feeling for width of muscle. We want that muscle to kind of, touch a little bit firmer. We want that muscle to touch harder. If it was to be real soft, we maybe, expect a little bit more condition on that animal, in terms of maybe some fat thickness. But we start at the rack, and then we work our way back. And we're just really feeling for muscle, and we want that muscle kind of meet our hand, with some sort of good texture to it, as well. So really, when it comes to handling market lambs and goats, it's just to confirm what we're seeing from the outside looking in. So on fat, I guess we didn't really talk about it, but when it comes to evaluating goats, we don't want goats to be necessarily too fat. We don't want our sheep to be too fat. When it comes to getting kind of paid on a trimness side of things, we want those animals to be appropriate in terms of their degree of finish, their kind of their fat cover as well. So really, when you study for fat, you might with kind of feeding those animals for a county fair, a jackpot, or a state fair, just kind of run your hands over their forerib, see how they touch. You don't probably necessarily touch like the kind of the front side of your knuckles is a bit more ideal. And then kind of down their back over their loin edge and see how kind of flush they are leading into their hips. It's going to be another way kind of to notice a little bit more fat. So we're going to go ahead and judge one of these classes. Let's see. So here on this class, really what I'm going to do is kind of talk through each of these goats and let you each kind of see what I'm seeing from an evaluation standpoint. Let's go. So here on goat number 1, I see, okay, this goat's kind of got a stout forearm. This goat's got some bones, some foot, some feature there underneath of them.
Hey, Matt, can you share your screen so we can see what you're seeing? We
Yes.
currently still see your PowerPoint.
Okay, hold on here. New share. Is that better now?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So here we got a class of 4 goats that would have came from the American Royal Kansas City. And I'll go ahead and break down a few of these goats just so you can see where I'm kind of thinking in terms of a thought process, in terms of what I might pick up on these things. So here on this kind of painted up whether, a goat that's still stout there in his forearm, goat that's got some bones, some feature there underneath of them. And then in terms of a body shape standpoint, he's got plenty of body shape, some roundness of rib there to him. Here on this rear shot, in terms of his upper hip width and kind of some pin width and hip spread, this one's plenty wide up here. He's good in terms of his depth of twist. His stifle shape is good, and lower glute shape, lower leg shape is good. And then from a base width standpoint, like what I talked about earlier, animals that are naturally wider there at the surface are going to have more muscle to them, to their skeleton. So from a base width standpoint, he's good, and he's still square from hock to ground, which is important. Here's kind of the overhead top view. So if I go to handle him, I'm handling his rack here and then working my way back over his loin. Just from looking at him, that one's got plenty of width up high, width over his top line. I'm sure we'll get a side view picture here in a second. A chest shot, one that's opened up, big and kind of wide and stout there in their chest is going to be important. This one's wide and also square. So structurally, what I do notice is this goes a little bit straighter in his knee, a little bit, weaker right there behind his shoulder, maybe compared to what's ideal, but still very good there. Number 2 here. This goat looks like he's a little bit longer in terms of his spine, his length of hips probably a little bit longer as well. He doesn't look nearly as stout, just kind of up front in his shoulder and his chest, maybe that kind of painted up red one. He also deviates a little bit right there behind his shoulder. So he probably doesn't have the same kind of muscularity in terms of his rack shape, and pinches more in his forerib. But at the same time, he's plenty good in terms of a muscle call, wide base, kind of big in terms of his stifle and lower leg shape. He does pinch like expected right here in his forerib. And if we had to see this goat there in the stanchion like we will in a second, my guess is that goat wants to kind of deviate a little bit more there in his right in behind his shoulder and forward. So, but from a structure standpoint, that's a nice structured goat. Even if he does kind of drop a little bit right there behind his scapula. So kind of like talked about there, his forerib gets a little bit flatter, but that's just kind of a body rib shape discussion there. Goat number 3, structurally, instantly what I'm kind of drawn to is this one's spine's a little bit more high, a little bit tighter. He deviates quite a bit behind his shoulder. That goat even out of his hip. Granted, he's bracing and he's pushing, but it looks like he's really steep there out of his hip. His hind leg looks a little bit straighter in terms of that angle, in terms of how he kind of sits down on those rear two. There, in terms of a rear view shot, it doesn't look like he's just necessarily as stout as a couple of the others. A little bit kind of narrower here in his upper hip, right here in his kind of his rack shape. He pinches quite a bit, a little bit skinnier in terms of his back shape. So structurally, not as good. Muscularity wise, he looks quite a bit narrower than the first two goats we might have seen. But maybe a goat that's probably not going to be first or second, but probably closer to third or fourth, depending on what this next one looks like. Yeah, we can now see his hind leg. His hind leg gets a little bit straighter, real steep there out of his hip. Spine jumps up in him a little bit more. Goat number 4, maybe a little bit stouter right there in his forearm. His stifle shape doesn't look like he's got much muscle there to him. He looks really kind of flat, one-dimensional there. But he does have plenty of base width. He's actually kind of a bigger footed, stouter featured goat there in terms of his bone work. He's a little higher, kind of shallower twisted. But goat's got plenty of body to him. Goat has maybe enough muscle. Structurally, though, I think he probably gets a little bit just too outside of himself or behind. Probably just a nickel straight as well, in terms of his shoulder blade and the way it sits on him. He also looks a little bit maybe smaller in size, a little lighter weight. But I think a good picture right here. We stop it now, but a little bit straighter there in his shoulder blade. He's also straighter in his kind of from his forearm, knee, down to his front feet. You see how he kind of bucks over there at his knee. He's a little bit flatter in terms of his leg shape. And then because he's straighter up here, he's real weak right there behind his shoulder. And from a structure, a muscularity standpoint, is he as good as the others? I don't know. That's, when it comes to making that judge's call, there, and that's kind of that show sense, you have to decide what you want to go with. So, if I'm placing this class, like, a stout, good muscled one, good bodied one, who's a little bit straighter there at his knee and one, you got that 2 goat here to the kind of the top right. It was kind of a nice pattern one, from a design, a structural standpoint. Not as heavy muscled as this one goat, but still has enough muscle. I like him the next best in terms of a body quality call. Rib shape, dimension wise, he's good. Between kind of 3 and 4 there on the bottom, maybe it gets a little bit closer between these two. This one's got a little bit more bone, some feature there underneath of them. This one looks maybe, structurally probably the poorest. Muscularity wise, he might have an advantage there. So it gets a little bit closer in terms of that bottom decision. But I would for sure go 1-2 in this kind of instance, maybe 4-3 on the bottom. So really, that's kind of the biggest takeaways that I would kind of pick up on. But you get kind of the chance to see how goats that have muscle, goats that have body shape, and are structurally, still correct and still nicely structured, ultimately balance up, so significantly better. We see a little bit of some areas where we can notice some sort of differences from a muscle call, and kind of a base with kind of conversation there. We see how, let's see, that was a good view right there of all 4 of them. This goat's a little bit narrower chested, wants to come in a little bit more at his front knees. This goat's kind of big chested. That goat's really opened up and big chested. So we kind of see some differences between them. I think a very nice class to, outline a lot of that. So